Do you remember the Great Gatsby? The man who ended up being a multi-millionaire who came from humble beginnings in North Dakota as a farmer? Well, it turns out he was actually a bootlegger. You find that out later in the novel. But this short video examines the growing income gap and the limits to social mobility happening in the United States. Why has there been a widening gap between the rich and poor over the last several decades? The first reason surrounds this idea of wage stagnation. The amount of income earned by the average person, the low to middle income earner in this country, has remained about the same for the past several decades. Now, in actual dollar terms, they're taking home more money. So if you look at what economists refer to as their nominal income, it looks as if they're taking home more money. But remember, income also has to keep up with inflation. The prices of goods and services has increased over the past several decades as well. So the purchasing power, or the real disposable income of low to middle income earners, has remained relatively the same since the 80s. Another issue which leads to this widening gap between the rich and the poor is rising tuitions, especially at colleges and universities. The average person not only has to pay the higher tuition costs, but is also burdened with substantial student loan debt for years after graduating. If you look at the principal and interest payment in total, it sometimes gets into the $80,000 to $90,000 to $100,000 range just for an undergraduate degree. Finally, there's been a $6 trillion wealth wipeout caused by the housing collapse. In 2007, 2008, the financial debacle began, which created and was also highly correlated to the housing collapse. There are lots of people in the United States today who are in a negative debt to equity position when it comes to their houses. That is to say, they owe more on their homes than it's worth. And you have to remember that post-World War II, for most individuals and families, their largest asset was the home they owned and lived in. The mobility of workers versus their peers has declined. What is mobility for a worker? It simply measures how easy is it for an individual to pick up from where they live principally now and to take a job somewhere else in some other geographic region. Obviously, people usually move for a better opportunity, but mobility of workers has declined. Not only has geographic mobility declined, but upward mobility. In other words, workers leaving a low to middle income wage earning opportunity to move up to a higher income or even high income opportunity for wage earning. So the fact that mobility for workers has declined significantly over the past 2.5, 3 decades leads to 3 economic problems. The first one is it threatens productivity. Productivity is a measure of how much output is generated per unit of input. One principal measure of productivity is how much output is generated per unit of labor input. In other words, how much does that next worker add to output of the firm? Now, obviously, if productivity is declining or remaining stagnant, it doesn't make a lot of sense for businesses to add an additional employee, which leads to the second problem. If productivity is remaining stagnant or growing very slowly, it reduces business profitability. Obviously, businesses pay workers based on how profitable they are in this quarter or this year or even in the past several years. So business profitability declining means there's less revenue to be shared among existing workers and probably less incentives for businesses to hire another worker. On a more macroeconomic level, the threatened productivity and decline in business productivity actually threatens overall U.S. economic growth. Remember, economic growth is achieved by 2 factors: either an increase in the resource quality or quantity, or an increase in technology/productivity. So in this case, less productivity means less economic growth. Economic growth is important for society because it lessens that burden of scarcity. It means we can have more goods and services to satisfy economic desires. So slower economic growth means a reduction in the standard of living for the average person. Now, what about this idea of humble beginnings? Well, let's look at the stats, right? Children from humble beginnings, like, it's less likely for them to make gains in wealth and social status. 70% won't even reach middle class, which is a pretty daunting number when you say 70% of the people born into the low income bracket will never reach the American middle class. Simply not the same opportunities as prior generations. The fact that wages have remained stagnant for low to middle income earners has created significant income inequality. Matter of fact, if we look back a couple decades to the 80s, income inequality has been rising, which means that today, for the people who are young, their good fortunes are more dependent on who their parents were. If we look at the numbers here, between 1979 and 2007, 1.7 trillion in annual income shifted to the top 1% of households. This actually creates all kinds of socioeconomic problems for the United States. It's one of the big political divides of our generation. The fact that there are some people earning significantly high or prosperous income at the same time, there's a very large number of people whose income by measure of their purchasing power hasn't really shifted all that greatly over generations. The United States of today is a much different socioeconomic picture than the one of compared to several decades ago. It could also lead to some type of social unrest when large numbers of people feel as if all the income generated by production ends up in the hands of the few, while we have the not so prosperous many. Final thoughts regarding this analysis of income stagnation and income inequality. Let's review our production possibilities model. If we look at the initial curve inside the arrow and the arrow to the right, obviously the goal of all economies is to continually improve your technology and productivity, improve your quantity and quality of resources, so that we can shift our economic production possibility frontier outward. In other words, lessen the burden of scarcity, produce more goods and services to be shared by all members of society. Unfortunately, all of the evidence of this article suggests we are less likely to be achieving a rate of economic growth to sustain viable incomes for large numbers of people in the low to middle income areas and low to middle income areas of opportunity.